Are you living by your own beliefs or restricted by ones you inherited? How many of the beliefs that shape your life did you actually choose? How do you know what makes a good person? What makes a successful person? What does a loving relationship look like? How should a man behave? How should a woman behave? What does family mean and how should it feel? Ultimately, do you know what feels good, what feels right, what's acceptable to you, and what's not acceptable to you? And how do you know? Because long before most of us could consciously decide what we believed, we were already being taught. We were taught by parents, family, school, religion, culture, and community. And even more so nowadays, the media, especially social media, and the groups that you might choose to follow. Some of what we've inherited may be deeply valuable. Some may have brought us wisdom, stability, identity, and belonging. But some of it may not be serving you. It may be restricting you and quietly building a cage around you. And this is the territory of the Hierophant, the archetype that asks us to examine the systems of meaning through which we've learned to understand ourselves and the world we are creating around us. Welcome back to Tarot Major Arcana. This is the 6th video of our sequential journey through all 22 major arcana as living pathways of personal, emotional, psychological, and spiritual development. We began with the Fool and the courage to enter experience. The Magician introduced agency and directed will. The High Priestess turned us inward towards intuition and hidden knowing. The Empress brought nourishment, creativity, and embodiment. The Emperor gave us structure, boundaries, responsibility, and form. And now we arrive at the Hierophant, who represents guidance, inherited systems, values, initiation, and transmitted meaning. This makes the Hierophant one of the most socially important cards in the major arcana, because we don't develop in isolation. We develop inside systems. And every system teaches us something about who we're supposed to become. This sequence makes enormous developmental sense because the Emperor creates structure, but structure by itself doesn't tell us why that structure exists. A family has rules, but what values sit behind those rules? A society has laws, but what principles are those laws intended to protect? A religion has rituals, but what deeper meaning are those rituals designed to transmit? An organization has policies, but what culture is actually being reinforced through them? The Emperor says there must be structure. The Hierophant asks what meaning is carried through that structure. And that takes us from external authority into something deeper, a transmitted worldview. The rules become teachings, the behaviors become values, and the structure becomes culture. The word initiation is useful here. It can sound esoteric, but psychologically it describes something very ordinary. We've all been initiated into systems of meaning. A child is initiated into a family culture. They learn what gets praised, what gets punished, what can be spoken about, what must remain hidden. How do we deal with anger? How do we show love? Who has authority? What happens when somebody fails? And who decides? Much of this teaching never occurs explicitly. Nobody sits the child down and says, in this family, vulnerability is unsafe. But perhaps every time someone becomes vulnerable, they're mocked. The lesson has been transmitted. Nobody says your value depends on achievement, but perhaps affection increases when the child succeeds and disappears when they struggle. Again, the lesson has been transmitted. The Hierophant, therefore, concerns not merely what we were told, it concerns what we are initiated into through repeated experience. Traditionally, the Hierophant is strongly associated with teaching, spiritual authority, and the transmission of knowledge. And there is a healthy reason for that. Human development would be extraordinarily difficult if every generation had to discover everything from scratch. We benefit enormously from teachers, mentors, proven frameworks, accumulated wisdom, and traditions. A good teacher can compress decades of experience into something another person can begin using almost immediately. A mentor can help someone avoid mistakes. A tradition can preserve knowledge that would otherwise disappear. A community can offer meaning, language, and belonging. So the Hierophant is not an archetype that simply says reject authority and think for yourself. That would be far too simplistic. Its deeper question is far more sophisticated. How do I receive wisdom without surrendering choice and discernment? The healthy Hierophant supports through wise teaching, ethical structure, and meaningful belonging. Each of those deserves attention. Healthy, wise teaching doesn't merely transfer information. It helps another person develop their own capacity to understand. The wise teacher doesn't want permanent dependency. They want development. In the ethical structure, values become meaningful when they guide behavior, integrity, responsibility, respect, compassion, and honesty. These can create useful structures for navigating difficult choices. And human beings need meaningful belonging. We need a sense that we're part of something beyond isolated individuality. We all need family, community, profession, spiritual tradition, shared purpose, and a culture that supports us. The healthy Hierophant allows belonging without demanding that individuality disappears. This is where the Hierophant becomes psychologically powerful. People sometimes imagine conformity as simply weakness, but conformity has such influence precisely because belonging matters. Historically, exclusion from the group could be dangerous. Even now, rejection can activate deep emotional responses. So when somebody discovers that their genuine values conflict with those of their family or community, the challenge is rarely just intellectual. They may know what they believe, but living according to it may risk disapproval, conflict, shame, rejection, loss of identity, or loss of belonging. That's why the Hierophant's lessons can be so difficult. The question is not merely, what do I believe? It's what am I prepared to risk in order to live according to what I believe? One of the most important themes of this archetype is inherited beliefs. Every human being inherits assumptions about money, about love, success, gender roles, parenting, sexuality, status, education, happiness, and even suffering. Some beliefs become so familiar that we stop experiencing them as beliefs. They simply feel like reality itself. Someone says you have to work hard for everything. Relationships never last. People can't be trusted. Family always has to come first. Real men don't show weakness. Money changes people. You should have settled down by now. And because these statements are repeated early and often, they may never be examined. The Hierophant helps us to question this. What beliefs are you living by that you never consciously chose? If you sit with this, you'll notice that it's a deceptively powerful question. Beliefs become especially powerful when they fuse with identity. There is a difference between I believe success matters and if I'm not successful, then I'm a failure. A belief can easily become identity. There's a difference between my family values self-sacrifice and if I prioritize myself, it will make me selfish. Again, the belief has become part of self-definition. And once that happens, questioning the belief can feel very dangerous because it no longer feels like examining an idea. It feels like threatening or denying who you are. This is one of the reasons why inherited systems can be so difficult to challenge. The person may not simply fear being wrong. They may fear becoming disloyal or ungrateful and immoral. If you feel too different, you can begin to feel very alone. The Hierophant brings those tensions into your awareness. The blocked Hierophant appears through a lack of guidance and confusion around values, and mistrust or resentment of structure. This can happen when someone has experienced authority as unreliable, hypocritical, or harmful. They may conclude you can never trust teachers. You shouldn't follow anyone. All institutions are corrupt. All traditions are oppressive. Their rules are all devised to enslave you. On the surface, this may look like independent thinking. But being triggered to reject every form of guidance can become just as limiting as blindly accepting it, because we can all have blind spots. We all need perspectives beyond our own. The developmental task is not believe everything, nor is it believe nothing. It's develop good, effective, honest, and accurate judgment. This creates an interesting paradox. A person can build an identity around being unconventional. I don't follow rules. I question everything. I don't believe in institutions. I think for myself. But if the person automatically rejects whatever is conventional, they're still being controlled by convention itself. They've simply inverted their relationship with it. True independence means being able to ask, is this useful? Is this true for me? Does this principle work for me, or is there a better way? Rebellion is sometimes necessary, but permanent rebellion can become another identity prison. The mature Hierophant can inherit wisdom without becoming enslaved by that inheritance. Then we come to shadow expression, which may appear as dogma, conformity, and external permission seeking. Dogma appears when a teaching stops being a guide and becomes an unquestionable truth. The person no longer asks, is this useful? They ask, is this allowed? The difference is quite profound. Dogmatic systems frequently reward certainty. They reduce ambiguity. They provide binary categories: right or wrong, us or them, acceptable or unacceptable, believer or unbeliever, successful or unsuccessful. And certainty can feel extremely safe, but psychologically, certainty can become dangerous when it removes curiosity and choice. The moment questioning becomes forbidden, learning begins to contract. Perhaps the most personally relevant shadow of the Hierophant is permission seeking. Many adults are still waiting for permission to change their career, to end a relationship, to start again, even to be successful, or to say no because they now want something different. They may want to live very differently from their parents, or simply become the person they feel they were truly meant to be. Nobody may literally be preventing them, but inwardly there is an imagined authority. What will they think? Am I allowed? Is this the right thing that someone like me should do? And that's where the Hierophant becomes incredibly important in personal development, because the transition from inherited values into consciously chosen values often requires us to become our own source of permission. At the same time, this archetype should not become an argument for throwing away all traditions. Tradition can carry enormous wisdom. Practices survive across generations for many reasons. Some preserve useful knowledge, some create ritual and meaning, some strengthen community, and some remind us that we belong to a history larger than ourselves. The question is not whether something is old, the question is whether it should remain alive. Does the tradition still serve the purpose for which it was created? Can it evolve? Does it deepen humanity? Or are the people serving the tradition long after the tradition stops serving the people? The healthy Hierophant preserves wisdom. The shadow Hierophant preserves rules simply because they're rules. This distinction becomes particularly visible in spiritual development. A spiritual framework can provide discipline, stimulating language, ritual, meaning, and access to accumulated wisdom. But spirituality can also become externalized. The person keeps looking for someone who knows better, a guru, a teacher, a healer, or a system that they can depend on and turn to in times of trouble. They continue to ask, what should I believe? And gradually, spiritual development becomes dependency. A healthy teacher points beyond themselves. A shadow teacher makes themselves indispensable. A healthy system deepens awareness. A shadow system demands allegiance. Again, the Hierophant's task is not blind belief or cynical rejection. It's a conscious relationship with choosing what to learn and who to learn from. Exactly the same thing can happen in personal development. People move from method to method, book to book, course to course, teacher to teacher. Each new model in the beginning becomes the answer until the next one appears. And there's nothing wrong with learning, but eventually development requires integration and application. You have to ask, what have I actually learned? What do I believe now? What principles have earned their place through lived experience? And what might I merely have borrowed because someone persuasive insisted I have it? That's a Hierophant threshold. Information has to become wisdom, and borrowed wisdom eventually has to become lived understanding. This archetype is particularly useful when someone repeatedly uses language such as I should, I must, I have to. People like me don't. My family would never. That's just not done. These sorts of phrases often point towards inherited values and rules. A coach or a therapist might become curious about according to whom? Who taught you that? When did you first learn that? What would happen if you did the opposite? Whose disappointment are you imagining? Ultimately, does this belief actually belong to you now? This is not about persuading the person to abandon their beliefs. It's about helping them discover which ones they actually consciously chose. I write about this in my book, The Tarot Major Arcana, where I encourage a far wider approach to all archetypes. I explain in detail how you can use each of them as a lens to reveal deeper developmental movements rather than fixed labels, unconsciously accepted by you or indeed imposed on you. If you're interested in uncovering far greater detail in real-world practical applications, then you can get it on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below this video. Relationships are another area where inherited systems become visible very quickly. People enter relationships carrying models of what relationships should be. Who should earn? Who should care? Who should initiate affection? How much independence is acceptable? How should conflict be handled? What counts as loyalty? And should couples stay together regardless of individual happiness or fulfillment? Very often, two people believe they are arguing about the present relationship, but underneath, two inherited relationship models are colliding with each other. The Hierophant asks which assumptions have been brought into this relationship without ever discussing them. That question alone will help transform some fundamental aspects of what you're experiencing. Which brings us to what can be one of the hardest Hierophant struggles, and that's family loyalty. Because becoming more fully yourself may sometimes require becoming different from the people you love. Different ambitions, different values, different relationship choices, different spiritual beliefs, different ways of parenting, and different ideas about what constitutes a happy, successful life. And that can produce guilt. A person may feel if I choose differently, I'll be rejecting them. But choosing to be an individual has nothing to do with rejecting them. It can simply mean I'm honoring where I came from without requiring myself to remain identical to it. That is a mature Hierophant at work. Inheritance then becomes your foundation rather than your prison. There is another important distinction here. Rules and values are not the same thing. A rule says, never do this. A value asks, what principle am I trying to honor? For example, a family might have a rule, we never discuss conflict outside the family. Perhaps the underlying value is originally loyalty. But if that rule prevents someone from seeking help during abuse, the rule has ceased to serve any value. So the mature Hierophant asks us to move beyond rules into principles. It's asking, why does this matter? What value is being protected? Is the current behavior still serving my values? This creates far greater flexibility without abandoning ethics. Eventually, a developmental shift has to occur. We receive teachings, we learn from traditions, we absorb values, we belong to communities, and then we begin deciding consciously what works and what we know we want to keep. This doesn't mean I answer to nobody. That would simply collapse us back into immature individualism. It means I become responsible for the values I choose to live by. I cannot simply say my parents taught me this, my religion asks for this, my culture expects this. At some point, adulthood requires ownership. If I continue living according to a belief, it becomes mine. That's a profound responsibility. So how might you know that the Hierophant is particularly active for you in your life right now? Perhaps you're questioning beliefs you've held for years. Perhaps you're seeking a teacher or a mentor. Perhaps you feel uncertain about your values. Maybe you're entering a new profession, tradition, spiritual path, or community. Perhaps you're torn between belonging and authenticity. Maybe family expectations are colliding with your own direction. Or perhaps you're constantly looking outside yourself for someone to tell you what the right thing is. The Hierophant often appears when life asks us, what do I genuinely stand for now? If you want to work with the Hierophant as a developmental archetype, begin with these central questions. What beliefs are you living by that you never consciously chose? Who taught you what success means? What did your family teach you about love? What did you learn about money? What did you learn about vulnerability? What did you learn about authority? Where do you still seek permission? Which traditions genuinely nourish you? Which beliefs have become restrictive for you? Where might you reject guidance simply because you distrust the authority? Who have been your most important teachers? What wisdom deserves to be preserved? What inherited rule no longer fits the person you've become? And perhaps the most important one of all, if nobody were judging you, what would you actually believe? And now something fascinating happens in this evolving sequence. Now we recognize the beliefs and values we've inherited. Life asks us to choose, which brings us to the next archetype, which is the lovers. And the lovers are far more than a card about romance. They represent relationships, polarity, vulnerability, alignment, and crucially, choice. The lover's energy is conscious connection, intimacy, and aligned choice with shadow expressions including projection, dependency, and triangulation. The Hierophant says there are values you were given. The lovers ask, now what do you choose? The Hierophant introduces inherited meaning. The lovers demand personal alignment. And that makes the next transition enormously significant, because eventually adulthood requires us to stop living entirely according to what we were taught and begin choosing what we're willing to embody. So the Hierophant is far more than a card of religion, institutions, teachers, or traditions. It represents the human relationship with meaning itself, the values we inherit, the systems we belong to, the teachers we trust, the traditions that shape us, and the rules that we've accepted and absorbed. This represents the process through which borrowed beliefs gradually become either consciously chosen wisdom or unconscious limitation. At its healthiest, the Hierophant gives us wise teaching, ethical structure, and meaningful belonging. Blocked, it can leave us without guidance or confused about what we genuinely value. And in shadow, it becomes dogma, conformity, and endless search for external permission. Its developmental invitation is not reject what you were taught, nor is it obey what you were taught. It's all about examining what you were taught, keeping what has earned its place, question what's not, learn from wisdom without surrendering discernment, and truly belong, but without disappearing, as you gradually take responsibility for the values according to which you choose to live now. If this deeper approach to the major arcana resonates with you, then please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, because it helps us share more as we continue to work sequentially through all 22 archetypes as living pathways of personal, emotional, and spiritual development. And if you'd like to explore the complete journey at a much greater depth, my book, The Tarot Major Arcana, 22 Archetypal Pathways to Inner Transformation, explores all 22 cards through their developmental, psychological, emotional, spiritual, blocked, shadow, and tree of life dimensions. You'll find the details in the description below this video. And in the next episode, we move into the Lovers, where inherited values meet something intensely personal: relationship, desire, vulnerability, and the choices that reveal what you actually stand for. For now, I'll leave you with one last question. Which belief has shaped your life most powerfully that you're no longer certain you consciously chose? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video for the Lovers.